Yeah, it is. It might or might not be there. Okay. So, hello, welcome. Some of you, welcome back. I assume you can hear me? Good. So, as you can probably read, I'm Tony Graham from Antenna House. The schedule says that this is Michael Miller and Tony Graham, but Mike Miller has to stay closer to home for family reasons, so he sends his regrets. He says hello to everybody. So for the sake of the YouTube, can you say hello back? Hello. There we go. They all said hello, Mike.
Miss you, Mike.
And thank you. So XSL-FO, CSS, and page media. We had the tutorial just before. This is partly about Antenna House. It's partly about how people are using page media. I assure you it's not going to be all about Antenna House. So the schedule is the introduction. That's me introducing this and a bit about Antenna House. Then we have 4 short talks, and then I can fill in some time with a discussion, a summary of the supports that Antenna House provides to developers developing style sheets of various descriptions, and then hopefully there's time for some discussion. We had some good discussion at the end of the last session, so hopefully there's time for more now. Hopefully you have more questions and comments. So who am I? I'm a senior architect in the XML division of Antenna House. If you know what that is, then can you please tell me, because it keeps changing. I'm based in Skerries in Ireland, where most of Antenna House is either in Japan or in the worldwide sales office in the US. I've been with Antenna House since 2014, but I've been working with markup and layout since long before then. But the more interesting part for me is, who are you? Where are you from? And how are you using XSL-FO or CSS? If you've ever been to a Schematron meetup, you might recognize this format. So, for starters, which country are you from? I know there's a lot. Anyone here from the Czech Republic? No, 2. Can you read that? Barely. Okay. I know we have plenty from Germany here. Who here is from Germany? I kind of run out of fingers. I'm wearing socks. If Liam was here, he could do it, but I can't. Keep on. I'll say 21. Another obvious target is Canada, apart from... Oh, I can't imagine why it would be obvious, but... Mohammed's not here, but we have anyone else from France? I got 1. 50% Huh? Yeah, well, they'll be glad to have you. I should mention Ireland. Anyone else here from Ireland? This is the loneliest part of the whole presentation. Who have I missed? Romania. That should be obvious. From Romania we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're happy to have you as well. 7. Come on, you've topped Canada, France, and Ireland. And who else have I missed? Netherlands. Yeah, I was getting there. It's late in the day. Netherlands, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Come on, you need 2 more to match Romania. Oh, it's 6. 1, 2, no 5, sorry. So in the medal tally, Germany wins, but that's all right. What? Oh, yes, I had a conversation with. Huh? 18. I haven't counted Denmark yet. How many Danes did I insult? 4. Okay, so. Sorry. Okay, Spain I can remember. How many have I got? Spain, how many? 1. Okay. Poland, is that PL? Yes? How many? 1. Okay, so Norway. I should have written smaller. 1? More than 1? See, this is valuable customer research. Anyone here from the UK? No. So we're practically all EU. We have free trade agreement with Canada, that's close enough. So how many of you are using XSL-FO? Here we go. Put one hand up for XSL-FO. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Let's say 15. So, FOs, keep putting your hand up. How many people are using CSS? You get another hand for that. So using both? 1, 2, 3. I'm going to get the FO people to put their FO hand down. 1, 2, 3. We only have 3 doubles. Oh no, I didn't. That was 15. CSS. Who's using CSS? Many. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh yeah, I lost. I'll just subtract 3 from the number. Let's see what that. Right, 1, 2. I know this is a tiring part. Here we go, Venn diagram. Oh well, no, that's not right. No, can't do it. So what sort of uses are you using a formatter for? It doesn't have to be, well, I should say, who else, alternative, other format, I mean, hold on, other formatting technology. We have tech users here. Other? He doesn't want to put his hand up for tech? 2, 3. What uses are you making pages for? Anyone want to venture a subject here? We have legislation. Yes? Who's making legislation? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Or should I have said standards?
Standards documents.
Standards documents, anybody other than Ken? If I said reference material, would you put your hand up? 1. Pharmaceutical information, anything? How would you describe what you produce? Truck manuals? Manuals? Oh, reference, I got 2. Manuals of any description? Well, I think it's 12. Anything else I should count? Exams. Oh, that's good. Just the one? And you have another area?
Academic publication articles, books.
All right, So we say academic articles and books. You know, yeah, I know.
It's books, it's magazines,
You know, yeah, I know. I mean, I can make a matrix of these things. We'd be here for the whole 90 minutes. So academic things. Oh, medical content.
invoices.
Right, right. No, I mean the invoices. Yes. 2, 3. Okay, so I think we can see that there's people from many different places are using a variety of technologies to produce a variety of things. So what are you looking for this session? Hopefully I can satisfy you without changing anything, but what do you want? Give you updates on things. People talk to you about how they're using things. And you don't need to answer now, I'll be around. But what do you want from the tools that you use? How can we improve what we do? I mean, you'll hear something about that shortly. So, as I said, Antenna House is based in Japan. The primary product outside of Japan is AH Formatter, which uses CSS and XSL-FO to make pages primarily PDF, but other formats. There's also Antenna House Regression Testing System, which you'll hear about, as well for comparing PDFs or images, which is useful for you change your style sheet, you want to make sure you haven't changed something you didn't intend to change. So you run your sample documents, you compare your previous results with your current results and find out if it all works as you expected. There's a product called Office Service Document Converter, which is a batch formatter, a batch translator for Word, Excel, PowerPoint to other things, which might seem irrelevant, but when people need it, they really need it. So AH Formatter, as I said, XSL-FO and CSS Formatter with many extensions. You can buy the whole product, which does both. You can buy a product just for formatting XSL-FO or CSS. There's the cheaper light version, which has reduced functionality. It runs on a variety of operating systems. As a Docker image, if you're using Docker, there's a web interface, so you can have one formatter running on a server and use the client to send your source and graphics to the server and get back your PDFs or other format. It works on either CSS or XSL-FO. You can run your style, make formatter run your style sheet, or you can do it as a separate process. It'll produce PDF. On Windows, it'll go straight to a printer. You get SVG of every page. You get the text if you want. You can get a PostScript output for people who need to use PostScript, and so on. We were last here in 2020, early 2020, turning 20 as a milestone in many cultures, turning 21 as a milestone in some as well. But we missed both of those milestones. The next milestone will be that AH Formatter will be 22 this year. It's not quite as significant or interesting as turning 20 or coming of age and turning 21, but Antenna House has been around for a while. Since we were last here, there's been multiple releases, 7.1 and 7.2. I hesitate to talk too much about version 7.3. I have permission to talk about some things, but if you're an Antenna House user, you'll also know that there's maintenance releases roughly every 7 weeks that have minor improvements and bug fixes when bugs come up. Version 7.1, which happened in Ireland in the first lockdown, added Armenian and Georgian support, more control over condensing and placing floats. These are just items picked from a laundry list from each release. I'm not sure which of these appeal to which of you, but it shows some of what happens with each release of formatter. You can use ICC profiles and variables in your CSS. The AH formatter GUI, which happens to be what we're using, next talk, can show multiple pages at once, so you can see sort of the bird's eye view of your formatted document. 7.1 added automated analysis of the formatted document, so you can find rivers, too many hyphens, too much white space in a line. If you have a lot of narrative text, you don't want to have to look through every page, try and find where things didn't work out. You can set limits on how much white space should be in a line, and it will detect it for you and tell you. Version 7.2 from later in 2021 improved the parsing of CSS, added the nth page selector. In your CSS, you can use a keyword for the AH formatter media type, so you can separate out your CSS rules, CSS properties that are specific to AH formatter, and they won't even be used by any other CSS formatter. Suppress duplicate. Footnotes, in the GUI you can display the bookmarks that are in the document, so you don't need to go to the PDF viewer to view the bookmarks that you've generated when in the PDF. For accessibility, you can produce expansion text, which is, you can add expansions to acronyms in the PDF to improve its accessibility. AH formatter version 7.3 should be here in September, but and it should add SVG 2.0 support for CSS Flexbox and CSS Grid, and in the GUI you'll be able to preview layers from your PDF. I find layers are useful for when you're making PDFs just for on-screen display. There is layers, you can control layers, set them for print to appear when a document is printed but not when it's viewed, or vice versa. Another product is the Antenna House regression testing system, as I said, for comparing PDFs or images. It works with PDFs from anywhere. You might not think it's much of an exciting product, but I was at the XML summer school, and there was someone there who, when they heard that I was from Antenna House, they just had to shake my hand, because he was using AHRTS every day, generating Word documents from XML, and he was using AHRTS to check, as I said, that he hadn't made any unexpected changes, and it would made his life so much easier. AHRTS, since I've seen you last, has produced version 1.6, which is really just a maintenance release. Perhaps you might need something to batch convert Word, Excel, or PowerPoint documents to PDF or images. So standalone library is the PDF XML conversion library, which will extract content from your PDF. It'll find all your tables, figures, etc., and it will produce an XML representation and separate out all the graphics, and then you can transform that into some other format. There's sample style sheets which will generate simple docbook from the PDF from which the content was extracted. I won't read all this for you, but this is how it works through all of the content. A product that we're looking for trial users is a sort of a merge product, merge data from Excel, CSV data or JSON data into a template Word document to produce customized, personalized Word documents. If you find that interesting, then contact Antenna House support. Antenna House also provides an I18N index library. There are languages for which you can't tell how something is pronounced just by looking at the characters. The classic is Japanese, where some characters have 50 readings where there's different pronunciations for the same character, which depends on the context, depending on, in Japanese, what sort of kana follows it indicates what it is. You need something, if you're generating an index for that, you need something to handle the readings as to when you're collating the index hits. Antenna House has a fair amount of DITA support, including the free PDF5ML plugin, which replaces the PDF tool. There's other DITA modules available on GitHub from Antenna House. There's the Oxygen add-ons that we produced also on GitHub. And sample style sheets for different applications. For example, working with the report from the automated analysis, there's documentation for the area tree XML which is an XML representation of the formatted area tree, which sometimes you can process to modify it and then reformat if there's areas that Antenna House can't quite do for you. And then, so that was my introduction. Are there any questions so far? No. So we have 4 short talks coming up. Andreas is going to talk about what's new, missing, or annoying in print CSS tools. Ken Holman is going to talk about his experience using XSL-FO and AHRTS in Rialto Online. Liam Quinn is still back in Canada. He's currently recovering from colon surgery, but I have a recorded presentation from him on accessible print, and Ken's trying to contact Liam now on Zoom, so we might listen to pre-recorded Liam, or we might listen to Liam live. It's not clear yet. And then Michael has a sample document and something else he added at the last minute. So those talks should be 10 minutes each, hopefully. So I'll ask Andreas to give us our first talk. No, we don't have any water. Okay.
Can everybody hear me?
Oh, no need to give you this, no.
Oh, okay.
Forgot about that.
Otherwise I don't have to cry. My name is Andreas Jung. I'm the creator of the Print CSS Rux project, and just to make it short, I will give some ideas, some thoughts that I collected over the last 2 years, basically driven by Corona and so. So what is Print CSS Rocks? It's basically a platform which provides vendor and project neutral information about Print CSS, which basically stands for the CSS page meter standard by the W3C. It contains some Print CSS lessons and gives you an overview over all existing tools in this area. And it also has some lessons where basically you can compare different features, how a particular CSS feature works in tool A compared to tool B, and so on. And it was actually born in 2017 after some party night. So it's around since 5 years. And the last major update was this year with basically included 4 new tools and also added some visual improvements. So most of you basically know the established tools like Print XML, Antenna House, and PDF Reactor, which are around since many years, some already since 20 years. But over the last 2 or 3 years, basically, we got some new tools like typeset.sh, which is a PHP-based implementation of the Print CSS standard. There's VisiPrint, which is Python-based, also Visual Style and Page.js. Some of these tools exist a bit longer, but most of them over the last 2 or 3 years basically made significant progress with regard to functionality and with regard to implementing the CSS standard by the W3C. And as I said, all 4 new tools basically are now available, and you basically can compare all CSS features against these different tools. So one point I'm always challenged by basically when I'm doing prototyping or doing some CSS work for customers or basically trying things out, think that I'm always missing. So this is completely highly opinionated. It's not an official what's missing, but I'm usually missing something like CSS Grid or CSS Flexbox in some tools. Not all tools. Some tools implement Flexbox, other tools implement CSS Grid, others don't implement nothing of them. Happy to see that Antenna House 7.3 will support CSS Grid and Flexbox, which will be a huge improvement. Because in some cases you basically want to implement something, and in some cases you want Flexbox and you see CSS Grid, and then you are juggling between tools. Another major problem across tools is basically some kind of footnote support. So there is a standard that we have in the W3C, but all tools implement a particular behavior. They render footnotes differently. In particular, in the context of multi-column environments, all tools behave differently, and always some features regarding footnotes are missing. And in many cases, we want to have a JavaScript support. Some tools are based on Chromium, for example, like Page.js and Visual Style, so it will basically come with a JavaScript support. Other tools like Prints or PDF Reactor, they have their own limited JavaScript engine, so there's always a struggle if a particular JavaScript module is working or not. So other things that are annoying in Print CSS, again, from my point of view, that many tools have different defaults when it comes to margins, font defaults, font sizes, and so on. Basically, when you just write something and run across all converters, in many cases you get different behavior, different default output. So in many cases, you basically have to provide your own CSS reset file in order to having a predefined set for the borders, for the paddings, and so on. Also mentioned that footnotes are basically a major pain right now across all tools, because we have a standard by the 3WC, which is the generated content for page media. And this draft or this standard basically just provides a basic idea about how footnotes should be rendered, but basically there is nothing in the standard about rendering footnotes in the context of a multi-column environment. So basically every tool behaves differently. Another major pain point when it comes to Print CSS projects, what we have that we are usually have the request that that we must perform some kind of adaptive rendering, for example, for images. For example, we had a use case where we want to produce cheats for security cheats, which were allowed only to be 1 page long, but with flexible text. So in many cases, we had to reduce font size automatically in order to avoid page breaks. And this kind of basically being able to interact with the rendering process in order to make design decisions ourselves, we usually need some JavaScript code. And right now, I think it's only possible right now with PDF Reactor and Prince XML to some point. But usually, we want that in all projects and in all tools. And in many cases, many tools provide different functions or different extensions. For example, in PDF Reactor, we have something like a method called XHTML, which allows us to include HTML either through the CSS or through some input files to make documents much more modular. I also want to mention a partner project by Andreas Zettel. He runs 2 sites, Print CSS Live, which is basically a sandbox where you can basically test something like you have HTML, you can enter your CSS in JavaScript, and then it allows you to basically render your input using different tools by just making the selection. Basically, have an interactive playground for testing out things and basically testing the functionality of different tools with the same input. So this is for free under Print CSS Live. And Andreas also provides a partner website which basically adds some additional resources around Print CSS. So he basically created a bunch of videos over the last 2 or 3 years regarding different aspects. So basically what I've done in my CSS lessons, he created, for example, a video for generating a menu for sushi restaurants, for example. So if you're interested in that, you can look at that. And Andreas also runs an own API service where you can basically just send your data, say, okay, this is my data, and then render that using some library. So that's my last slide, and that's perhaps the most controversial slide here. Right now, I think we are in a deadlock situation regarding the standardization process. Because from my perspective right now, there is no real leadership for Print CSS, basically the CSS page meter standard and the related standards, because the draft of page meter is 8 years old. And basically, from my point of view, the complete standardization process is kind of dead or frozen. I might be wrong, but that's my personal observation here. On one hand, we have the commercial vendors like Antenna House, Print XML, YesLogic, and PDF Reactor. On the other side now, we have 4 free open source projects like ViewStyle, VisiPrint, Page.js, and Typeset.sh. And they basically stick very much to the W3C standard, while the commercial vendors, of course, implement the standard as well, but they also have their own extensions just based on business requirements, customer requirements, and there is now a gap between both. Because when it comes to extensions, for example, like footnotes, the Print CSS projects, the free projects basically say, okay, we implement only that what is in the standard, which basically is a W3C standard, and the complete process at the W3C is basically dead or non-existent. And there's also no discussion between the vendors and the projects. And that, for my perspective, the question, are we here in a standardization deadlock? I leave this to you. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
Hi, everyone. I get to present all 3 days this week on 3 different projects that I'm on. The first project is this startup out of Ireland, realtaonline.com, and then 2 of my volunteer standards projects tomorrow and at the Schematron on Saturday. And I wanted to talk about, Tony asked me, what am I doing with XSL-FO and how am I helping my clients? And I've long been in the standards world. I started in ISO standards in 1988, and I joined a number of committees. I've written a number of standards, and when it came to the point of writing a standard, I was asked to use Microsoft Word, and I had no interest, nor did I own a copy. So I did note that ISO had an XML vocabulary for standards. So I threw together some FO style sheets in order to create the PDF for my standard that I was authoring, and I sent them the PDF. And I posted the style sheets for free online in case there were any other editors who wanted to use it. Well, someone picked up on that, and they've now commercialized that set of style sheets, and I've joined them as an advisor to work with them. And Rialta Online services national standards bodies that have an obligation to print ISO, CEN, IEC, CENELEC standards for their country's members for sale. And ISO doesn't actually do any printing themselves. It's always the national body that has to do the printing, and they have new obligations to work with the XML. And so Rialta Online offers an online service where you throw up your XML and the graphics, and down you get PDF and HTML. And we have the ones that I can talk about, Switzerland, Netherlands, Ireland, are all using our online service as national bodies. CENELEC is a regional body for Europe. They're using our service. GSO, the Gulf States Organization, they were our launch client, and they have a regional obligation. Standards Digital is an example of a third party that is selling their services to their clients, in this case Standards Norway. So they are providing a service to Standards Norway, and they are using our service in that fulfillment. GSO also does that for Bahrain and Oman. And so they are an example of both a regional and a third party providing a service for national bodies. So in your country, if you know of anyone who works with national standards and the publication of ISO standards and all that, please let them know about this online service. Now, GSO is interesting in that you can see in, come on, I want to, there we go. We have both left to right and right to left. And since they were our launch client, from day one, I had to support the ability to publish both left to right and right to left in our work. And we also have to support HTML for our standards clients who are publishing simultaneous. So I have an example of a screenshot up here where we have the table of contents and the ISO cover page. And the XML that we are dealing with comes in kind of 3 different flavors. The ISO STS is the legacy format shown here, where different layers of international, regional, and national information are all captured inside the standard. Well, that has migrated now to NISO STS, which adopts a layered approach where you take your standard that is at the international layer, you wrap it with an adoption, so that's the regional adoption of the international standard, and you wrap that with an adoption for the national? Well, our clients needed to be able to work with automated feeds from CEN and from ISO and IEC. And so what we've done with the NISO STS is we have this custom metadata, which is all part of the model, where we actually go to the CEN feed and we fetch a standard that the national body needs to adopt. We incorporate that XML or that PDF into the final published product. We can either fetch it from a service or we can just merge it from the local machine. So that's the input, that's the world that I'm dealing with. So Tony asked, what features of FO have I found useful or have found interesting? And I thought to how I have guided my colleagues in how I have addressed some of the formatting issues that are required. And the first one I want to talk about is this variable content at the bottom of the page. You can see here, and this is the GSO cover page, so you've got Arabic and English, and the information at the bottom. Well, when a standard incorporates information for multiple organizations, you have to reflect that in the footer. So you don't know where to begin putting that information on the page. And so I use the footnote construct, which grows from the bottom of the page up. And then I just pour into the footnote as much content as is needed, and thereby the starting point is wherever it needs to be. So if you have to grow content from the bottom of the page, you may not be thinking about using the footnote because it's named footnote, but it is a really handy construct, especially when you have things like these copyright statements with variable amounts of text. You don't know where to begin. And the footnote is really handy. You start at the bottom, you pour in your content, and the content grows up the page. I already mentioned Arabic. I have to guide my colleagues. Do not use left, right, top, and bottom. Do not use. Use start, end, before, and after. Because you write that once, and it applies whether you're doing right to left or left to right. And it even, if you're doing, which we aren't doing yet, the vertical Japanese or Han languages, going vertical, all of the start, end, before, and after work without changing. And that made my job as a developer really easy in FO. Another thing, I got burned once by fonts. If you look at the way page 1 of 2 is formatted on the screen, I thought, oh my God, everything is out of place. Look, the separation between the digits and the letters is off. Please, Antenna House support, what have I done wrong? And Antenna House support advised me to turn on these lines, which we saw in Tony's presentation earlier. It's a very handy set of lines. Notice the impact of the font metrics. This F overhangs into the character spacing, and this 1 has white space between the character edges. When you turn on these guides, you can see that the intercharacter spacing is precisely identical in all cases. But to the eye, you see that there's crowding here and not here. So keep in mind the thoughts of fonts and how the fonts are going to impact what you're doing. Lists, you'll find this diagram very handy. My colleagues did on the way lists work in FO. The right margin can move and the list is still able to be presented. I'm going to be running out of time. Keeps. A very handy construct in FO is keeps. Imagine you have a figure with 2 graphics, and each graphic has a title. You can express a keep around the pair of graphics, and a stronger keep between each graphic and its title. So if the pair of images does not fit on the page, it will break first at the lower level of keep. And that will allow you to still keep the stronger titles next to the image itself. I'm going to stop that and just finish up here. I'm going to go a little bit long, I apologize. Here's an interesting approach to produce the HTML for our clients. The nice thing about FO is that it is tolerant of foreign namespaces. You can throw into an FO instance information in namespaces other than FO, and it will be ignored. And I leverage that. I augment my FO with enough information that I can transform the XSL-FO into the HTML without having to go back to the original standard document. So my semantic interpretation of my input is done once. It's mechanical to go from the FO to the HTML. So you don't have to repeat your semantic logic of going from your source XML to HTML. So if you have to support two different formats, I highly recommend this approach. Take your FO layout and actually transform that into the HTML. You can see here that I have decorated my FO with attributes in the X namespace, and I am specifying the HTML construct and the class name for that construct actually in my FO. This gets ignored by the XSL-FO processor. My XSLT transformation knows to take this block, make it a div with the class name attrib. And that is there's no semantic interpretation of standards going on producing the HTML. This will produce either pre-format or code. So in the CSS, I can then do the semantic interpretation of the appearance. And I can include information that's ignored entirely by putting it in an element. Finally, AHRTS. So far, with the number of clients we have, I have 110 different entry points on the server that will produce either PDF or HTML or PDF and HTML for different countries. And to know that I have made a change in the core and what the impact is, AHRTS is amazing because I can just say, please rerun my 110 entry points. And oh, by the way, here's my old, here's my new, and you can see highlighted in yellow the differences. I changed my page number formatting from Arabic to Roman, and there's my difference. And then, yes, of course, the difference would appear in the table of contents. So if you have lots of PDFs to check with AHRTS, that will make your job easier. And that's what I wanted to say. And I apologize for going late. Any questions about what I'm doing with FO? No. Thank you.
We haven't had contact with Liam Quinn today, so we're going to have to play the presentation he recorded earlier, which means I'm going to have to put the microphone next to the computer and hope it all works. So
Quinn with Delightful Computing, also at Paligo. And I'm here to talk about, or I'm not here to talk about, accessible print.
I was trying to go through
What do I mean by accessibility?
Subject to inherent limits of the medium, for example.
Can you hear that?
There's nothing you can do to make a radio accessible to someone deaf, but they ought to be able to turn it on and off so that other people can listen, for example.
So,
Hello, I'm Liam Quinn with Delightful Computing, also at Paligo. And I'm here to talk about, or I'm not here to talk about, accessible print. What do I mean by accessibility? The things we make, whatever they are, should be usable by as many people as possible, subject to inherent limits of the medium, for example. There's nothing you can do to make a radio accessible to someone deaf, but they ought to be able to turn it on and off so that other people can listen, for example. More than half of people have special needs around accessibility. They're not special needs if it's more than half, they're majority needs. So this stuff really does matter as well as being legislated. Let's start with text sizes and font sizes. Text smaller than 11 point. It's going to be pretty difficult for a lot of people to read or off-putting. You can get away with slightly smaller text in print than on the screen, but only slightly. Smaller than 9 point, though, and many people will just stop reading, they won't read it at all. Then it's not accessible because people didn't access it. A large X height helps. It's really the size of the majority of lowercase letters that matters the most. In some languages it matters you can see the accents too. Depends too on reading distance, obviously. But around 9 and 9.5 point is a good minimum. You also need to think about the contrast, the ratio between foreground and background lightness. In print this depends on the colour, the texture and the glossiness of the paper, as well as on how dark the ink is, what colour you've chosen to print in, and the ambient lighting of the person reading. Smaller text sizes usually need more contrast, but it's not easy to measure, it's just something to bear in mind. About 8% of men, on slide 5, about 8% of men, 0.5% of women will see, for example, reds and greens as browns, or they'll see red as black, or some other combination of colours. And more than half of these people are unaware. That's roughly 5% of people are colourblind and don't know it. Keep in mind the consequences of people not seeing the different colours in your document. Right, so print in black and white and see if it works, for example. Speaking of black and white, dark mode has become popular, but in print, thin light-coloured lines on a dark background, they get eaten away and look thinner and become thinner than you expect. So you need to use bold, strong fonts with low contrast, low difference between thick and thin lines. And sometimes you need to add letter spacing as well, depending on how much the ink spreads. Talk to your printing house. Small sizes of text over a coloured background can also be hard to read, or even a grey background. Because of the dot screen process, you can't print grey, you have to print lots of dots, and those dots introduce a high frequency component that interacts with the typeface. And if colours are misaligned, which a registration problem is fairly common in a lot of printing technologies, then your thin text might have little bits of yellow fringing or red cyan fringing or magenta fringing, and that can make it very distracting to read. Again, talk to the printing house. They know. Whether or not they're yellow fringed, typefaces matter. Studies in the English language at least show very clearly that people read serif fonts much better than sans. They remember more of what they read and understand better. And Garamond is the most trusted typeface, especially in the United States. If you want people to believe a message, say it in Garamond. Huge studies over a long period have confirmed this. It's really not in doubt at this point. Slightly irregular fonts, like the one I'm using for these slides, IMFL, help dyslexic people. Specialist dyslexic fonts, on the other hand, hinder people who are not dyslexic. So I use this font as a compromise. Keep unusual letter shapes, though, to large sizes. Things like, watch out for strange ampersands, for example. People might have to puzzle them out slowly if they're not familiar with letter shapes, and it can be a hindrance. Anything that slows people down reduces understanding. Another thing that can affect understanding is whether your text is justified. It turns out people read fully justified text much better than left-aligned text, and understand more. I was surprised by this. Regular line lengths and good word spacing. So line and good line spacing of 1.2 to 1.5 of font space. Sorry, it's a mistake in my slide there. Leads to highest comprehension. I should say regular line lengths, good word spacing and good line spacing lead to the highest comprehension. But at line lengths over 50 characters or so, people start misreading, so keep your lines suitably short and use hyphenation to keep word spaces even. We all need to know where we are. I mean, a city like Prague, old Prague, is really difficult to find your way in because little gnomes come and rearrange all the streets and move the buildings when you're not looking, and you walk back an hour later and things are not the same. In a book, running heads and footers are very important to help you know where you are. So the running head will typically have the chapter title on every page, or every odd numbered page, and the even ones will have the book name, and the footer will have the page number in it at least. Beginnings of chapters need to be big and bold so you can find them when you flip through the publication. Use headings to help give context and show people where they are. Transitions between sections can be usefully marked with an initial cap, a larger first letter, or with a line if there's no title. That way, when you're flipping through, you find the beginning of the section quickly. People do need constant clear reminders about where they are, and the study of print and typography and people with cognitive differences is still in its infancy, but we know this much. So these have just been a very few things. Here's a few more, not related to type, to font size. In a publication with endnotes or footnotes and links, don't make people flip pages. Use margin notes or footnotes, because flipping pages is very disruptive. Margin notes are much less disruptive than footnotes because you go horizontally to find, or assuming horizontal text, to find the note, and then you can easily go back to the line you were on before because it's parallel. It helps to use different footnote markers for explanations and for citations to references. So 1, 2, 3, for example, for explanations. References to other publications could be just in a bibliography, and you wouldn't need to look at them all directly because you use it differently. Cross-references, try and give good information. See chapter 16, A Holiday in Moria, on page 96. Gives the title, I've got an idea if I want to go there, it gives the chapter number, and it gives the page number. If it's on this page, then don't do that, say on this page. And if your software can't do that, get better software. Make sure that page numbers are easy to see and read. If you just send someone to page 96, they're flipping through, the page numbers should be near the outside edge, also called the foredge of a book. And they must, of course, be in at least 9.5 point text and clearly separated. Otherwise, people can't find them and they'll get lost. Well, don't you get lost, but this is my last slide, so I'm going to get lost. Here are some references that may help you. The first one is about text sizes and has some references that may help about studies. Colin Wheeldon's book, you love or hate, but it's one of the few books on the subject. He's constantly trying to say how important his book is, but it does talk about lots of the studies of readability and understanding. And then there's specialist sites like colorblindawareness.org. I'll leave that up. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, so good afternoon. So there was all day long in the afternoon, in every talk there was something where I had an association because, and I could talk about that and we could discuss that, but I tried to stick to what I planned to do. So many things have been mentioned and I tried to, so in case, well, we find a chance to talk about all this stuff, at least tomorrow night. So even though the announcement was a sample document, this is the sample I brought with me. It's actually printed. It's how it's called, perfect binding. It's quite nicely cut, so there's the bleed area could have been smaller, but it's quite a good printing shop who did this. It's roughly 600 and something pages, and I have an example as a PDF that is 700 and something, and I don't know what the maximum limit is. And we come to some features later on. Paged output with CSS. What are we doing? I'm accompanied by 5 colleagues. We are based in Bamberg, which, if you haven't visited it, please do so. It's World Heritage Site, and it's located in the region, which is probably important for some of you, with the highest density of breweries in the world. And we are a software company. We have a bunch of products. I'm not boring you with that slide, but the one that we are using to create the input for page media is a component content management system, which is of course based with XML, and we have a client, and we do all that kind of stuff that you do with a component content management, store all the bits and pieces, manage translations, and all these fancy stuff that is usually done with the content management system. We have a number of internationally known clients, and it's a good business, and we're happy to primarily, we're not selling, the marketing point of view is we have a product, but actually in the majority of the cases we're doing projects. As you may be well aware of this wording, either software follows process or process follows software. So if a company of any size buys a major ERP system, they usually have to change all their processes to apply them to the new software system. And we sell our component content management system, most of the cases the other way around. So that is, we add additional interfaces and adjust the system to the processes of our clients. And so that leads to very interesting challenges all over the place. The second thing we have is, for a few years now, we have a web-based tool that helps to define layout properties for page media, and also still in the works for HTML-based output. We heard something similar from the folks from Synchrosoft in the morning. We call this the Docufile layouter, and the end of that is a layout package. And I'll come to talk about what this contains. And the third thing in Creative Page Media is Antenna House Formatter. So we are a kind of decade-long, 2 decades-long customer of Antenna House Formatter because all the extensions were required to fulfill the requirements of our customers. And so that means, yes, we use XSL-FO in all our legacy PDF pipelines. They are based on XSL-FO because if you have a running pipeline, you don't change it. And of course, all the XML handling is done with XSLT, of course. So, well, this is a no-brainer. So basically, our setup is as follows. We have the component content management system at the top, and if someone presses the necessary buttons to create a PDF format, we create something which is labeled here. We call it DXML, DYXML. It's basically an internal format that we defined, which is a subset of HTML5, but we add our own XML schema and schematron files. So that's how it's heavily controlled. You cannot just take any HTML5 and call it DYXML. We have a specification for that and a build process, and it's even during this publication process, it's always validated. If there's something, if someone messed up with some XSLT and this package is not valid, the publication process will stop. On the right-hand side, what is labeled DLZ, that is the layout package that comes from our web component that creates the layout package. And it contains basically two things, XSLT style sheets and CSS. CSS files that, of course, are compiled from SCSS files, etc., using all the technologies applied. And then once the user has pressed the button, all this is in the background, and we allow multi-selection and do it at night and all that kind of stuff. We have a microservice. That MS is not Microsoft. That is a microservice. I should use a different abbreviation. And that takes the data package and takes the layout package. And the first thing the microservice does, it uses the XSLT from the layout package to enhance our data-driven DYXML package. As we heard before, you have to kind of create additional content that can be used in the headers and footers of document. We, for instance, use this to create table of contents and index and all this extra stuff that is only required for printed media. That is all handled by these standardized XSLT style sheets. And then we get an XML which is enriched for page media, and then we call Antenna House Formatter together with the CSS files, and the result is the PDF. And all that is pipelined, et cetera, et cetera. And the example I brought with me is an award-winning documentation. The award is not primarily, or not only for the print quality and the layout, it's also for the content structure because it's by the TECOM, and they look at the content, et cetera, et cetera. But the company, MIM Truck and Bus, has some, for some trucks, they even have that label on the title page. So they are quite proud of this, and that is the primary reason I can just wave around with this example, and if you want to, you can have a look at it, because it would take too long. I just switch over to my PDF viewer here we have. We heard the mentioning, okay. PowerPoint is disturbing me, so I guess I have to end the presentation. Okay. In our process, we have handled the problem with perfect binding and the single page for the cover and the back and the spine. And so the process first creates all the pages of the content, and then it knows how many pages there are, and then there is a formula of the thickness of the paper, and then it automatically creates the final page. And that is, for instance, the PDF result of the final page for such a document, and the spine has exactly the calculated width. So that is part of the automation in the process. No one has to kind of guess, is it 650 or 680 pages? It's done by the automation we implemented. So that was mentioned previously, that this could be a kind of a pain to handle this nicely. Also, one of the first requests was to do this for Israel, so that is in Hebrew. So we all benefited from mainly what Ken mentioned. Even though it's my impression that in a CSS layout we do not have as much start and end and before and after. We have far more left and right and top and bottom. But during our automation, in the CSS compilation, we have a function that just switches the properties from margin left to margin right and vice versa, so to handle that. No? It's pretty much the same. We have a function. We don't know whether the customer defines the color in RGB or CMYK. So we have just a function that analyzes how many values are given, and we know it's CMYK or RBG. So just to keep things easy for clients. So this contains a lot of information, and just to save you from the extra effort to read a Hebrew text, that is the English version. And you can see there's this 3-column layout, and it has to fit in the box, on the truck, etc., and whatever. And of course, they try to put this electronic in their system and avoid printing this, but currently they have to print it. And if you want to highlight just one thing, if we page through this, and I use the facing pages mode just to that you see it. You're wondering, why is this page empty? You know? Why is this page empty? Well, there's a rule that if you have a full-size graphic with annotations, with callouts, then they should always appear on facing pages. So that is kind of part of the, we know there's facing pages, and we know in the preparation that it has callouts, and so we force it on the next left page. And therefore, necessarily, and in some cases, the previous page spread has just one paragraph up here. But that is, I glanced through this document to find a good example, and I'm on page 597. There are 2 or 3 similar cases before, so it's a statistically problem, basically. But having said that, if I go back one more page, you can see there is a subheading down here at the very last column. And if we heard from Liam, we heard stuff that was primarily familiar to me from the desktop publishing from the 90s, basic rules of desktop publishing and bookmaking. And if you would do that manually by bookmaking or in InDesign or whatever, you would not leave that piece of information down on that page. You would move it to the next page. It wouldn't hurt the pagination. The document would not be longer. And that is one of the kind of things where now that, for instance, Antenna House moved from line-based layout to paragraph-based layout, wouldn't there be a chance to kind of look at columns, look at pages, and have kind of keep rules sensible enough to kind of detect a situation like that? The simple requirement from the customer, who also thinks about this, is from starting here. The simple requirement is something like this. So they think, well, the heading shouldn't be too low on the page. In case the heading is too low on the page, we want to have it moved to the next column. So that may or may be successful, and the idea we came up with, we create some hidden image, which is not visible, but has a certain height, and force it to that, and in case that image doesn't fit the column, then jump to the other page. Basically, we gave the customer an estimate, and they said, oh no, that's not, we don't have enough money for that, but
We have an extension for that.
great. And that's the reason why we come to Prague. That's the very obvious thing. Yeah, so that is the question. From my point of view, this should be done only if the document size is not, if the document does not grow, because the next thing the customer care about is the money for the printers. And in case you have more pages and you have multiples of 4, then you have potentially 4 more pages, and suddenly it's not so important that the layout is perfect. So that is everything I wanted to show. One more thing. We are always interested in talent regarding these technologies. In case you feel you have an idea that working for a company based in Bamberg, you can live elsewhere, then just get in contact with me. So that is the last bit of, I have taken way too much time, but you promised to throw me from the stage and didn't. Thank you very much. So in case you want to have a look at, if you want to have a look at that, just, I leave it at the front desk so you can.
Thank you, the Bamberg Tourist Department. So I don't think we really, as Michael said, we didn't really clap at the end of Liam's presentation. A round of applause for all of the presenters, please. So the theory was that I'd soak up remaining time with a summary of what I would call developer supports from Antenna House, but we're very short of time, so I'll flash through some of this, and then if I can do it all in 5 minutes, we can have 5 minutes for questions. So what I would classify as things that Antenna House provides which help you not so much write the style sheets, well, not write the style sheets for you, but help you in your process of developing the style sheets and getting something that you can then let other people use. I consider that the AH formatted GUI is probably the best thing because you can preview your formatted document before it goes to PDF, so you don't have the cycle of format PDF, open the PDF and look at it. Antenna House provides multiple samples and books. There's the Oxygen add-ons for different formatter files and for XSL-FO files. Visual Studio Code, we now have an extension you'll hopefully get to for writing CSS files that use Antenna House extensions. We couldn't get Oxygen to, I don't know how Oxygen would let you extend their CSS support, syntax highlighting, etc., but we can with Visual Studio Code. As you've heard, there's AHRTS for comparing the results to your style sheet, and of course Antenna House provides support for its customers, and there's places to look on the web for support. This isn't a transition, so AH formatted GUI, graphical preview, drag and drop your source and style sheet if you're a drag and drop sort of person. You can control some of the output options, and when you have the document open, you can open the document, open the CSS style sheet. You can look at the area tree XML of the formatted document from the menus in AH Formatter. As you've seen, as Ken alluded to, you can look at the borders of the document. You can get some basic information about the font size, the colors, etc. AH Formatter, as I said, you can look at a single page, you can zoom in or out, you can look at 2 pages because, again, spreads in an actual physical book are a huge part of the presentation of the document. I mean, as we've seen with Michael, you can look at a spread on the screen as well, but it's an essential component of a printed book. A recent version added the multi-page layout so that you can look at multiple documents, multiple pages at once. Which can show you some bad page breaks very quickly, or you can look at how multiple spreads are going to look together, or how pages make spreads. Antenna House provides multiple samples and books. There is, of course, the online manual if you're using XSL online manual, which describes interfaces, output formats, etc. Recent versions have links to available samples. If there's a FO sample, there'll be a link to the FO. If it's covered in the current introduction to CSS for Page Media book, there'll be a link to the PDF from the Antenna House website. So it's sort of more connected than it used to be. As I said, there's the samples collection, which I counted these, and I was surprised there's over 220 samples for different aspects standard FO formatting objects and properties, as well as Antenna House extensions. If you're a CSS user, a lot of these properties work exactly the same way between XSL-FO and CSS, so ignore the fact that the properties are in attributes, they still work the same way. With the sample collection, you can look at a formatted PDF to get an idea of what happens. You can look at the source to see how they're used. There's another section on the Antenna House website called Tips and Tricks, which has occasional, they're really blog posts about things that you can do with AH formatter or other Antenna House products that don't really count as discussing properties or anything else. As I've said, there's the book on CSS for paged media, for which you get the PDF, and you can also get the source and the CSS to see how the formatting in the book was styled using CSS. There's a few pages from the book. You would have seen some of these graphics in the earlier tutorial. A new book, which only came out a week or two ago, is Mastering Antenna House XSL Formatter Extensions. This is a translation of a book that's available from Japan. This is still, I think, a work in progress, but it covers many, maybe all Antenna House Formatter extensions. Here's a spread from there, sort of. This is covering reference areas for where to place a float. Something which is hot off the press, was made public yesterday, is an XSL-FO CSS comparison, which could be useful if you're looking for you want to find out what are the differences between the two. If you're using one, what differences are there in the other? This grew out of user requests for this sort of information. As I'll say tomorrow, initially we had a table with a few rows in it, and it's now a 150-page book. It's sort of like a fractal thing. The more you look into it, into the details, the more details there are. But the couple of page table is still in there, so you get the overview and then look at the details that interest you. The website has some sample style sheets for sort of tutorial on developing XSL-FO style sheets. As I said, with Oxygen, you can run AH formatter from within Oxygen. From AH formatter GUI, you can open these files, the area tree, etc., in Oxygen. And we provide multiple frameworks. You can set up AH formatter GUI or the command line AH formatter as an external FO processor and use that in your transformation scenarios. It's a bit blurry over there, but the top one is the definition of an FO processor, and the bottom one is the sort of FO processor tab from a transformation scenario that selects to use AH formatter GUI. The thing with the GUI is that if you use the -S option, it'll open it in a running instance of the GUI, and when you reload a file in the GUI, it reopens the same page. So you can work on your XML and your style sheet, run the transformation, the GUI will reload at the last page you're looking at. You can see if you made any difference and so forth. So it's, personally, I find it convenient when developing style sheets. But basically, I've covered that you can open many files from AH formatted GUI. We provide multiple Oxygen frameworks for different types of files. FO check has been around for several years and is even bundled with Oxygen. More recent ones are for the option setting file, hyphenation information, and the font configuration, which you might have to work with at different times. As I said before, Visual Studio Code we now offer an extension that does auto-completion that provides hover information for in CSS files that you're editing in Visual Studio Code. It provides a short description of the property, the allowed values, and a link to the manual, and if possible, a link to the corresponding XSL 1.1 definition where it's an extension that's carried across. Again, a link to the page media book if it's useful or applicable FO samples. AHRTS, you heard about from Ken for comparing files. What I will point out is that with AHRTS, you can customize the XSLT that it uses to generate the summary report and the individual report. So on the left is the summary as it was at one point. On the right is a different version that I used where I also needed to add extra information from another source that worked from the file name of the files being tested. That's all done with XSLT, and it can be localized as well. The individual report can be customized with your XSLT, different XSLT. So for online or for a database, web-based thing that I talked about a few years ago, I modified the individual XSLT for individual reports so that the summary, the metadata page is at the end. So I didn't have to scroll past the metadata to get to the actual result. As I said, AHRTS is localizable. The uses Java property files. Antenna House provides support to its customers. Ideally, you're within warranty or within the maintenance period. It accepts bug reports, enhancement requests, and if you want to subscribe to the Antenna House announcements list, you can send an email to support@antennahouse.com. I hope that you've always found Antenna House support to be helpful. Yes? Okay. There we go. You're all on record now. Thank you. There's also a contact us form. Some people contact Antenna House that way with the question they have. If you use Stack Overflow, you could use the Antenna House XSL-FO or CSS page media tag, and we'll look at it, and sometimes questions like that answers come from other users. Sometimes some will have an XSL-FO question, which is really a sort of, how do I do this in XSLT? And people will respond going, well, I don't really know XSL-FO, but this is how you fix your XSLT, and that's what the people need. So it's also there. So the summary slide, you have the GUI, we have samples and books, Oxygen integrations, Visual Studio Code integration, AHRTS, and of course support at antennahouse.com. And, oh, I'm 1 minute over. I'm as bad as everybody else. Thank you for your time. Yes.
Liam says thank you for watching.
Oh, well, okay. So, no final questions? I mean, are there any final questions? That's what I should have said. Yes.
Well, I was interested to hear your perspective, your point of view, the questions that Andreas Jung raised.
Ah, yes. I was hoping we have time for that.
The leadership crisis in CSS, that's an interesting concept.
Yes, yes. I mean,
But I think it's now time for an expert meeting.
yeah.
It's in a different room.
You know, you see, you talk about leadership crisis, he just walks out on you. I mean, no, I know that. He's going to the XProc meeting because he's involved with XProc, wrote the book. I mean, if you go back to 2014, I said something similar about XSL-FO itself and CSS, as in it's hard to know, but I still don't know what the answer is. It's not a question we're going to answer here and now while people are packing up. We'll have to talk about it some other time. So I should have also said, if you have any questions about formatting, formatter, CSS questions, XSL-FO questions, I'll be around for the whole conference. So again, thank you for your time.